It's 420. Everyone go take a hit.
Hey there.
Hey there, friends.
Oh, goodness. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Oh, man, what a week.
Exactly. It's almost over. We're almost over.
It is almost over. And this year is just flying by. I can't believe we're already here in mid-February, almost mid-February. Valentine's Day next week.
Nice. Yes, we're coming up on that. I was wondering when the next pay period is because I've already spent all the money I got. That January is so rough. It's like, it seems forever. It's like, and with the VA, they gave you your VA disability payment for January like 3 days before Christmas. So it's like you have all that stuff, but you have to like hold it over in reserve for like the last 2 weeks of that of December, and then you know, for the longest month of the year, you know, all 75 days of January, you have that one same paycheck. So yeah, I was sure happy when February's came through, but you know how it is. It's like the federal government, you know, you keep spending and you still have to pay it back afterwards. So nothing but debt.
Well, next month we'll be talking a little bit about disability and patients that are on disability. So that will be, we got to talk about that conversation.
I'm always surprised how few people apply for the patient subsidy. That's one thing I tell every patient. It doesn't matter how much you make, apply for it.
Yeah.
And see what happens.
It really is a great program. It sounds like they're a sponsor, but Dragonfly has a really great subsidy that does help out quite a bit with defraying the outrageous price of Utah cannabis.
And did they tell you why you were denied, Zach?
Nope. They just said that they'd let me know if I was ever approved, and I was never approved.
Who was that with, Zach, if you don't mind asking?
UPC.
UPC, okay.
And the Wholesome Co. and Dragonfly Coalition or whatever they have, or some weird thing.
Yeah. You know, and that I don't want to speak ill of people, especially those that have slighted and shivved us in the past. But you know, that's my one concern when we have nonprofits that are completely managing a subsidy program for a state, where there's no accountability, there's no oversight, there's no making sure, like, are we only doing this for people within our alliance or outside, or you know. So that's always, I've always been I've spoken outward about the subsidy program. There definitely needs to be some oversight to make sure that, you know, everyone's getting a fair opportunity. You know, you can't apply for welfare or anything unless you you know, you have equal opportunity and access for everyone. So I do think that that's something that we need to look in the future to the program, whether that's through legislation or state regulations or whatnot, how that needs to be done. I definitely think we need to overhaul and woke the subsidy program.
I think that's true. You know, we do collect fees every time that a patient buys and purchases product in our dispensaries here in the state. There's a $3 service charge, and I think it would be absolutely appropriate for them to use some of that funds the state collects for a subsidy program. And I know it gets kind of tricky, but I see in so many states where they set up these either adult use programs or medical programs, and they try to tax it and fund and support all these other pet projects the state has. And I really find it irresponsible that they want to do that type of behavior. But when we have a fee that's going for patients, it should go right back into the program. So I'm hoping maybe during the summer, as interim comes up, patients who follow us know a little bit about our political voice will come and join us as we kind of raise awareness for that. Because like Zach, he falls into this category where he is the rich poor. He works a full-time job. He has an income, but he is still not making ends meet. And he is an example of many other patients. I've gotten phone call after phone call people telling me for whatever reason, they haven't gone to one of the 2 subsidy programs. There are 2 programs, and there isn't something for them. They want TRUCE to be able to do a subsidy program, and it's a conversation that we've had amongst our board. But you know, there is that concern of, we don't want to be accused of playing favorites. We would like a common criteria that most people can get into the program on. So definitely a conversation worth having.
Well, and especially, you know, you talk about with the $3 fee plus all the fees for all the practitioners, all the growers, all the whatnot, you know, they're sitting on.
Oh yeah, their fee.
It was an $8 million surplus. I heard it's now closer to the 11-12 range and growing.
Oh really?
So
yeah,
I mean, money grows when it's sitting in a pot and not being used. Money has a way of multiplying. So. But no, that's definitely something that we should look into. But before we go any further, I think we need to introduce our special guest, who is sitting below us in the. Need to get in the mirror reverse of this. No.
Yes.
Hey, William.
You invited somebody to join us today. Yes.
I did. I invited William. William, would you like to just introduce yourself? Let's just
go
get into it. Right.
So I'm William. I'm a nurse and nurse practitioner. I'm a QMP. I work at 2 different practices. Any questions on the table? However, I'm an adult nurse practitioner. So, you know, it's interesting because the state program does have the cub option, and it's been very disappointing in terms of cubs, because we don't turn them away, but we give them a very good expectation right when we need a cub, and we tell them we want them to have a card, but it likely will be denied. We tell them don't pay the office fee because you probably won't get approved. They still want to move forward. In the early day, all cubs were approved, and it was kind of an interesting process. And now the cub process actually takes quite a long time. So I actually only treat adults 18 and up. But on my patient panel, I have probably 40 patients that started out on cubs, and now they're just good old greater than 21. But any medical question is on the table. I'm always happy to look things up for people. I'm happy to give out my email if anybody has any, non-live stream questions.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, William, for joining us too.
Sure, absolutely.
I know that patients who are joining us have questions, but I also have questions about what it's like for you as a QMP in the program. We have, it's not a big secret that TRUCE was not a big supporter of this component of the program, because specifically the patient caps, we felt that was really a strange piece of legislation to have. I don't see that practice. I come from the medical background, and so I've never seen a practice where we limit how many patients we allowed to have it. And so that was a big reason why we pushed back on the QMP program. We wanted to help facilitate a more strong relationship between the physician and the patient. But understanding now, a lot of doctors are just not comfortable with what the state was requiring to be part of that recommending group. So tell me a little bit about your experience in that. What is your view? What have you so far?
As soon as I got my QMP license, I immediately applied for the 275 up to 600, primarily because my understanding of the patient limits was our culture here in Utah. First, the state did not want a rush on opening medical card clinics, a reasonable concern, unfounded but reasonable at the time, and what is called the data waiver. So in opioid use disorders, previously, up until December 15th of last year, providers could treat patients with medications, and they were tightly controlled, meaning you had a panel. So that law has now been struck down, which is kind of interesting. So I do actually think that Utah, either the patient limits will go up, or that will become a thing of the past. I hope they double it, and then they double it again. and then they realize that this is a kind of a silly practice. The neatest thing about our law, the limited medical provider program, but unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of limited medical providers. Those providers can have a very small panel. And just like you said, as a QMP, this is the most frustrating part of the law, because I would love to treat anybody who walks in the door, but my little ticker says, William, you're approaching your 600 patient limit. And then I have to look through my list, and I have to contact patients that were certified a year ago, and I say, are you wanting to continue? And some of them have moved away, some of them have passed away, and it turns into a little bit of a negotiation that if someone's not going to use their medical cannabis card and they're not living in Utah, I'm faced with having to say, okay, well, do you really want an active Utah card? Because I have somebody that's waiting for that spot, and that's somebody who's waiting for a spot.
That's such a problem.
It's really frustrating, because most patients understand, once we explain to them that there is the limit, they get why we text them so much and why we email them so much. Either you want to have the legal protection of the card, or you want to go buy cannabis in Utah, or really we have to cancel the card, which is the worst thing in the world, is to revoke a card. But we do it when someone dies so that we can open up that spot. It's a very morbid thing. The only other really frustrating part of the law, in my opinion, is the possession limit, because one of the things that I see is almost nobody has one qualifying condition. So the part of the law that I love is the fact that our qualifying condition list is long and very generic and wide. A lot of people think that that's not true, but I could actually argue that we do have more qualifying conditions, and they're stated in a very generic way, that they're not actually a diagnosis per se, but more of a kind of a syndrome. For example, Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a type of dementia. Alzheimer's is written into the law. Therefore, someone who has Parkinson's has actually two qualifying conditions: Alzheimer's and persistent muscle spasms. That's two.
Right.
So the fact that our legal limit is so low, given the fact that people may be using different products, that legal limit should go up just a little bit, maybe to 6.5, so that patients could have a flare medicine, a daily medicine during the day, daily medicine at night, and then something else for a secondary condition.
I love that you shared that, William, because I started out when I used cannabis about a decade or more ago. I was using quite a bit more per month than I am now that I'm more stabilized, but I definitely have flares. So I have noticed during the winter time, I am consuming a bit more, whether it's for seasonal depression or whatever it may be, more flare-ups. I have a nerve damage, so the cold is always really tough on me.
Absolutely.
You do use more. And so I'm one of those patients that has my card. I don't use the system a lot. I have the card mostly for protection. I talk about how I get better products, flower products, from my traditional market dealers still. And I don't quite get all that I need, and I can't afford the cost in the dispensary. So there's still a lot of problems for patients. Do you see a patient retention issue from your angle? Are patients who come to you pretty committed? Do you see them sort of fall away after a couple of months because they find it cumbersome? What do you typically see?
I see about 80% of my 600 panel. So I try and make sure my list is full, so I'm helping as many people as possible. And then I have kind of an informal waiting list that I know for sure that as soon as someone, decides it's not for them, that I can go and have their appointment. The retention is interesting because my two jobs, one of which as visiting physicians, we actually use regular medical insurance, whereas at Green Health Docs, it's private pay. There are advantages to both, because anybody with a flex spending account or health savings plan can actually do either regular medical insurance or private pay. And all the patient has to do is ask for an FSA or HSA letter saying that yes, the appointment was medically necessary. these days, most of us that have HSAs or FSAs, we can reimburse ourselves for our own medical expenses. Right. And that includes the cannabis itself. So the one thing that I wish patients would ask for more is a letter right now, because they're about to do their taxes. Every purchase at a dispensary, you give me a number, we'll pull the EVS report. Every expenditure is medically necessary because you're in a medically oriented program. And so that turns into a tax deduction. It may not offset a lot of the taxes, but I'm surprised how few patients ask for letters of medical necessity. We have a template that we use. We basically create a number and put that on the letter, and it actually offsets things. You ask about retention. I would say about 80% of the original patients that we were certifying when EVS came online are still patients, where at one of my practices, I'm the sole provider, so I get to see them very closely, whereas the other practice, I have 8 peers where we all share a pool of patients, and that works nicely. Again, it's kind of, for me, the patient, the expenditure to pay for the office fee, that's a hurdle. The possession limit is a hurdle. And then me having to manage my list and count my people and make sure everybody's, using their card or wants a card. Some people leave the program and they work in another state and they still want the card for when they come back to Utah. And we always just ask them, if you want the legal protection, keep the card. If you're going to use it to go to a Utah dispensary, keep the card. If you're going to use the card in an out-of-state position, keep the card. Our cards are actually good 100% in the District of Columbia, and a lot of people don't know that. So in DC, you can walk in with a Utah card, no problem.
And that's good, because a lot of these places will give especially in adult use states, if you're a medical patient, you can get that medical pricing as well as medical dosing. Some of those states have a higher dosing milligrams for patients, which is a great sort of bleed into the next little conversation I want to have with you too. The patient's gotten a card and they're ready to go into a dispensary, and every patient's different. Their endocannabinoid systems have different requirements. For many, many, many moons, many decades, people thought the highest THC possible is the best medicine out there. Here at TRUCE, we have advocated against that philosophy, realizing that is really quite damaging. Not everybody needs high THC. In fact, a lot of people gain a lot of benefit from very minimal THC. So what is your general practice and scope in counseling patients?
So I practice a form of medicine called functional medicine. And at both jobs, we have a little bit of versatility in how we ask this question. For example, what is the number one way in which a medical cannabis user can get more out of their cannabis? First off, let's ask some questions. Is the vitamin D3 low? First off, what are the 2 main conditions which cause vitamin D3 to go low? Chronic pain, meaning chronic inflammation, PTSD. And we don't actually understand why both of those conditions lower our vitamin D3. But if we kind of take a microscopic look down into the blood, once the cannabis gets into the system, into our bloodstream, it acts like any other pharmaceutical. It's actually carried along in the bloodstream by proteins. And those proteins are dependent on our hormones. So almost universally, and I hope I don't piss anybody off, but healthcare providers are so excited about testing for vitamin D3. And if I have a patient that comes in and they have chronic pain and or past trauma, I don't test them. I have a conversation with them and I let them know that if their vitamin D3 is low, that they're going to have to take a lot more cannabis, meaning a lot more expenditure at the pharmacy. So a majority of adult patients, again, I only see adult patients, a majority of adult patients with a chronic inflammatory condition, a gut problem, or PTSD need to take 4,000 international units of oral vitamin D3 daily for their cannabis. See how I said that? I didn't say for their general health. We assume the cannabis is going to work and we flip the diagnosis and we focused on how can we get more out of the cannabis. What the vitamin D3 does is it helps the thyroid, the adrenal glands, and the reproductive organs have more normal functions so that the cannabis that the patient does take lasts longer at lower doses. The translation is that I grew up in Georgia and Florida, and I'm very interested in penny pinching. And in fact, you're right, high dose THC very rarely is for anybody, but having a little bit of vitamin D3 and having that conversation is actually quite important. The only other vitamin that we know for sure is important, more so on the ulcerative colitis and Crohn's side, is vitamin B12. So at least in our practice, I talk to patients a lot about vitamin D as in dog 3, and then a lot about B12.
Okay. And
is that oral or by injection? Because I know B12, isn't that one of the ones that works best through injection?
That's a very, very complicated question, but
okay.
But if you lack part of your gut, like a veteran who's had an injury to the gut, or if you have a gut problem, then the answer is yes and yes. If you have a functional gut problem or you lack part of your gut, then you probably need B12 injections and oral. But very little blood testing is actually needed. These are empiric things that are actually based in the knowledge of chronic inflammation and how things are absorbed or not. So ulcerative colitis, gunshot wounds to the gut, hepatitis, hep C, certain types of Crohn's, certain types of IBD, and then things like pernicious anemia, oral and injection.
so let me ask you a little bit about modality when we talk about cannabis. When you come in to see you, I am assuming patients get a little conversation about vitamins and making sure that they don't approach cannabis as a panacea. There's a lot of other things going on that can be really helpful. One of the things I've added, I'm a migraine patient. I have trigeminal neuralgia. So one of the things I've added to my dietary is magnesium. Magnesium is very well known to help for muscle spasms and migraines and that kind of thing. So do you really give patients a full kind of conversation? It's not just solely hyper focused on cannabis and cannabis dosing. It's whole body health.
So we kind of have to, because in my opinion, my main job is to get the patient ready for the pharmacy consult. Right. And we have great pharmacists here in Utah for the most part.
Yes.
Unfortunately, EVS does not allow us to document multiple conditions. This is also one of my biggest complaints statistically, because when Utah has cultivation, we will eventually have cultivation. Growing things in the desert is very difficult. One of the metrics that state legislatures want is, what is the burden of illness? And in EVS, we can put any document, and oftentimes I document the nature of the QMCs, plural. Very few patients have one qualifying condition. In fact, I've met very few. Chronic pain is always more than just pain. Migraines. Migraines is usually two things, two different types, and or nausea. Chronic pain, musculoskeletal, always includes muscle spasms. A gut problem is a disease of a smooth muscle. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, automatically two conditions: chronic pain, persistent muscle spasms. So in general, I think it's my duty to be able to say, we have to ask them exactly what they're experiencing so that we can put that on EVS and really put that onus on the pharmacist, not to just sign off on chronic pain, but to say, holy crap, this person's having chronic pain and nausea. Where's the nausea coming from? Maybe the chronic pain, or maybe not. So we oftentimes, at least how I practice, is I put EVS all the pertinent details, which will give the pharmacist the maximum latitude to dispense the maximum number of remedies, so the patient can go in and try those things and have them fail, and then go back, try something different, and get dialed in.
Nice, nice. So do you really work closely with the pharmacists then at the dispensaries?
I wish pharmacists would call me more.
It's I'm sure that it's a hard thing. You have, 3 pharmacists at most at some of these. That's a lot, but most are only functioning with 2. So, and if they're carrying your 600 patients, they're carrying a few other QMP's 600 patients, and it could be hard. I see how that bottlenecks and you don't get the response that you're wanting. So,
well, it's an interest. I just wanted to interject with an interesting, William brought up how, the system only allows for one condition. And like you said, most people have multiple conditions. I know I have at least 6. What's ironic is when we hear the legislature talking, especially senators like Evan Vickers and whatnot that are claim to be science-based, and they're so excited about, the studies and collecting this information, but then they have this gaping hole of where they're not collecting information, and then they're basing decisions off of that very inaccurate portrayal of what the real condition lists are and what people are suffering from. And so, I definitely think, I'm mixed here, because one, I don't think they should be having the database and studying us as everybody's opt-in automatically and whatnot.
That is correct.
The libertarian side of me is like, oh, hell no. But I do appreciate when we're legitimately doing science and collecting data. I've always loved data. That's probably the neurotypical or neurodivergent, side of me that I love data, because with enough data, you can formulate the whole complete picture and find a solution.
I have a way around it in EVS, and I do it, and I've not been told not to do it. You document everything possible that cannabis might help with in the first appointment. And then with every certification, you change the diagnosis. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, as someone has 6 or 7 certifications, EVS correctly documents those conditions. But as you guys know, now all first cards are 6 months, all second cards are 6 months, unless you have a terminal condition. All third cards are 1 year. So I only get to document 3 conditions in the first 3 cards. And that's why I document exactly what the patient's going through.
And let me add to that, William, that just to that point, and then I'll let you continue. That's going to be changing. This year, Senator Escamilla has presented a bill so that we would only be doing our renewals once a year. And so that does change that dynamics that you're speaking about, and a bit of why I think these conversations are good to have. We need to go back to our regulatory bodies and help them understand that this system isn't set up to capture the things we really need to start focusing on. The interim is coming this summer, and that's where we really start to dive into how the structure of our program is looking. Right now, we're looking at starting a cannabis commission, which would be a body of people managing this program a bit more hands-on instead of just leaving it to the state and the vendors to sort of duke it out. We need a little bit more oversight so that we can take in problems like you're sharing right now. So I don't know, honestly, if a lot of
we should call the Cannabis Consortium.
Right.
The Cannabis Consortium's a funner word to say.
It is. But we need to hear from people like William, because this is a very, I'm learning a lot, listening to the dynamics on your side of the things, which you have to kind of contend with and tracking what the state wants. It is problematic. I mean, you go to any of our medical files and all of us have comorbidities. We have a whole list of it. So this is interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead and continue, William.
I was going to say one of the neatest things that I do at Green Health Docs, so my other job, is I get to during the pandemic, the emergency telemedicine rules are in place, and so I've been able to help take histories from the other states, and this really helped me become a better practitioner here in Utah, because one of the most important things to understand about the human body, especially with regards to cannabis, is there are 3 types of muscles in the body. This is why I love our Utah rule. The law says persistent muscle spasms. Everybody think that has to do with skeletal muscles. It doesn't. If a girl comes in and she has severe muscle cramping of the uterus is not a skeletal muscle, it's a smooth muscle. So there's cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and then smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is replete throughout the body. It's in our blood vessels, it's in our eyes, it's in our uterus, our prostate, it's in our adrenal gland, it's in our liver. It's part of what forms our gut and our lungs. And there are multiple medical conditions that can be lumped up under smooth muscle spasticity, one of which is the jaw clenching of PTSD. So when I'm taking these out-of-state histories, one of the questions that we always ask is, do you clench your jaw or grind your teeth? If somebody has generalized anxiety disorder, they say no. That's not who I'm treating. That's not who I'm dealing with. They always say yes. And that is why we can understand the fact that PTSD actually does have an extremely tight connection with that endocannabinoid system. Said differently, the gut is a smooth muscle. So it probably was haphazard, but whoever said persistent muscle spasm in our Utah law really did the patients a large service. Because what if someone does have generalized anxiety disorder and yet they have a gut problem, but they don't actually want to spend the money to get it diagnosed as Crohn's or ulcerative colitis? Can they get a card? Yes. Should they get a card? Yes, absolutely. Same could be said for any problem in the reproductive tract. For example, benign prostatic hypertrophy, prostatitis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, polycystic kidney disorder, and these are all on the good old FAST application. I wanted to review very quickly so that people really understood from a CUB standpoint. CUB is not just for people that are less than 21. CUB is for any indication. And the list of what the state of Utah CUB committee has approved is very long and very generous. So the state of Utah has approved via CUB treatment of medical cannabis for diagnoses ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, non-chronic types of pain that are special, other rare and genetic illnesses, which we have many, autoimmune illnesses where there's not nausea, not spasm, and not pain, yet some form of debility or disability, and ADHD. I probably mentioned that already. So that's an exciting part of our law, because any provider can certify any patient, any age, for any condition on the long application. It may take a couple of weeks, but in general, that gives our law a lot of versatility.
You've had people get through CUB in a couple of weeks. I've had patients it's taken a year.
We counsel patients now. Before what's called the red cap petition, which started about a year ago. We did paper and pencil essay type of applications, and our rate of success was much higher. The rate of the state coming back to us and saying we need more information was a lot lower. And in fact, I would say at the very beginning, once EVS went live, average time to payment of the fee to CUB approval was about 6 to 8 weeks, assuming you had all of your medical documents ready to go and ready to upload to EVS.
Okay.
Now it takes a long time.
Now it sounds like a little bit of that was a prep work on your part, knowing the expectation and prepping. Because I think I have dealt with some other QMPs who have met some challenges and they just would rather not deal with all that stuff. And so then I refer those patients to one of our kind of standby QMPs who kind of takes and really likes to do those CUB cases.
So what we do typically for a CUB, we encourage them first not to pay their office fee unless they are truly committed to not getting a card for a year. And then we pull back a little bit saying, well, probably it's going to be more like 6 months. But one of the other things is that the state of Utah, we have to think through who is on the CUB committee, which is clandestine. It's not published. So I oftentimes refer to them as a group of white-haired, white male physicians at the state Capitol building sitting in a dark room.
Yep.
These physicians may or may not be cannabis friendly, but their idea is to over accentuate the risk and underappreciate the benefit.
Right.
And in practice, what we actually have done is we get patients to write down every provider they've ever seen, and we write a medical records release, one for every provider they've ever seen, and that becomes part of their petition. Even if those medical records do not come in, we have gone through the effort of actually trying to, get those medical records. We also put people through that functional medicine inventory, which some people really like. Other people think we're trying to pry, but we ask them about every part of their body. Dyspareunia, which is painful sex for a man or a woman, is a qualifying condition. Chronic pain is chronic pain, regardless of where it is, why it is in the body. So we have individuals that have pelvic pain, pelvic injuries due to birth or trauma or service in the military who have painful sex. That's a very hot topic, but if we document it and we document everything about why cannabis might help, then the CUB petition is more likely to go through.
On that particular point, this is a reason why we wanted to advocate for suppositories to be allowed in our program to help those types of patients.
Absolutely.
We still don't have access to certain modalities. And I think that's just a ignorance or phobia of things like that. So this is just an amazing conversation.
Yeah, no one should be worried about, but
Stop.
it's a normal thing.
This has been a really informative conversation, William. I've really appreciated your depth of knowledge and your willingness to share with patients. I just want to do a little bit of an open call, just because we're coming up on the hour, to see if any of the patients would like to.
So we got a question from Jill.
Oh, great.
We got a question from Jill already. So let me just go right to that. William, can we get your email address? You offered to give it earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The letters npwm@dr.com.
And if you can, drop it in the chat, William, if you wouldn't mind, before we depart. And we'll make sure that, if that's okay with you, that we add it to our post when we share with people that this is up and going. Yeah, is there any other questions? Patients who are here in the Zoom, if you would like to ask any questions of William, please just raise your hand or go ahead and ask.
I'll say one other thing.
Of course.
In general, Utah requires one face-to-face appointment at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I have realized that I really hate this part of the law.
Yeah.
But it was actually part of trying to limit the initial onboarding of lots of patients. This really is a big disservice to patients that need medical cannabis in rural conditions or rural areas.
Agreed.
And it actually is prohibitive. So if there was one part of the law that I would change, that's the part of the law I would change. The next part, increase the limit. Third part,
yes,
do away with the QMP provider restrictions on the number of patients.
So from my understanding, you're going to get a few of your wishes this legislative session. The same Senator Escamilla is addressing that telemed conferencing to make sure that, and I don't know what the criteria, it just says is to allow that to happen under certain criteria for patients. So that is great, because we did have a lot of homebound patients that couldn't get out. And I only know of one QMP that does house calls, and those are really, do you do house calls too? Oh,
absolutely.
Wonderful. That is wonderful. So some of our patients are.
Yeah, that's a huge thing, especially for veterans. The common companion, in fact, some say they're married to PTSD, is agoraphobia. And, so when the VA started doing telemed, that was life-changing for so many veterans. So yeah, we need to keep the accessibility, and that's the big word is accessibility. If we're removing that option, because COVID's over, that's we need to expand access, not restrict it or put it behind paywalls or in real life visits or whatnot.
I agree. I think that's, I'm really happy to have seen that in the legislation. I'm hoping that it passes. I know that there are, some QMPs who are not happy with some of the changes that are happening. They base their model on those renewals. And so this has, a lot of different conversation viewpoints.
I love doing the follow-up, but I hate having to talk a patient through how to press the button that says save and submit for certification, because the entire appointment is about navigating EVS, and we don't get a lot of time to talk about the actual medical follow-up. So I love talking to patients, but it creates the making the follow-up into me being tech support. Not so much a provider.
Yep. And I think I have run into that same point with the other QMP, where she does the office handling of some of that, now click this step, which is really needed, because
and it's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not. Yeah. It wasn't.
I'm pretty computer savvy. I mean, look at my background. I have so many computers. I have one here. I am very computer savvy, and I needed tech support. So if that's the case, like, imagine my dad, who's say 74 years old-ish, who, spent 3/4 of his life without a computer, who has to call me, how do I get to the internet on my phone? How is that person going to tech support and register, you first got to go through the state ID program and then log into this program, but you can't use Safari, you have to use Chrome. What the hell, guys? Like, really?
Yeah. Oh, goodness.
But that does need to be simplified.
It does. It absolutely does. Well, and this is a little bit of what's been so enjoyable with you, William, is just hearing all the problems. But also, that's what I'm hoping happens, that we get more of the players who are dealing with this in the same room, so we can kind of improve the program. I know before we got on air today, on our post, we had a patient and an advocate, Steve, who had asked, what do the legislators think they're doing? I go to other states and I access programs, and none of them are quite like Utah. It seems like Utah's really convoluted. And I think William captured that point early on. It has a lot to do with our social climate here. The church has a lot of influence.
Utah, with its mountains and valleys, Utah. This is the place.
I've spoken to a couple patients in Mississippi. Mississippi's program is about 9 months old. And it's amazing how similar their early program is to Utah. There is the burden of the electronic registration. There is the confusion of what is a qualifying condition. And then there are providers that are actually very pro-cannabis that are actually not actually thinking through what a qualified condition is in a larger sense. They're pro-cannabis, they like the idea, but it also scares them because they're treating it as a traditional dangerous pharmaceutical. So I do know that Mississippi is going to have a lot of the same challenges as Utah, but that also means that we can help people in Mississippi because their program probably will develop very similarly to Utah.
To that point, what many people may not know, and a bit of why I tried to stay heavily in the politicking here, Utah's considered a flag state, so a flagship state. So when you see legislation like the Religious Freedom Act, when you see gun legislation, when you see anti-abortion bills, when you start seeing some of that type of things, a lot of times they come from Utah and then they spread to those conservative states. When we had our program come online with the CBD only, you saw a surge across the country of CBD only legislation. And so I get very concerned when we pass things in Utah, because it doesn't just affect us. Those conservative states pick our legislation and try to redo it. And so I agree with you. I hope that they get to learn from our mistakes, because we're making a few. And but also,
and then we'll export it through ALEC.
Right, that's concerning. The thing I think it's important for all of us to remember, though, there's not one state that has it perfect. Not one of them have a perfect program. There are those that have been around a while that have definitely improved programs, and that's where I'm hoping we can learn some lessons and do with ours as well. So yeah. Let me ask another question. We had a little thing happen to us last fall with the announcement that there were some synthetics in our synthetic byproducts within our products in the state. And I don't know how many patients came to you and asked, or if the state even educated you on what they were finding. But I am curious about what that relationship is with the QMPs and the health department, and situations like this when we have product quality concerns. Just like to get your thoughts on what you know and what you heard and what you hope to see.
I have found the technicians and nurses at the Center for Medical Cannabis extremely helpful in how rapid they respond to the QMP requests. We QMPs have a specific channel that we can use 24/7, and within about 12 hours, we can get a technical response. There is the front-sided medical cannabis email that all patients can use. There is a specific CUB email, and I have to applaud the nurses and the technicians at the Center for Medical Cannabis, because they really do make an extraordinary effort to address our question. Now, oftentimes it's a legal question, and they'll refer us to either the law, or they'll say, well, we can't comment because that's kind of an interpretation thing. There was a limited amount of education that was distributed through the monthly program newsletter, which is on the public side of the website, medicalcannabis.utah.gov. There was very limited information technical at the pharmacies. There was a lot of buzz in the news media. In general, patient concern about the presence was actually pretty low. So there were some patients that actually had very significant questions. And if I could be so direct, as I could say that these were patients that were using the medical cannabis pharmacies here in Utah, but also dipping into out-of-state resources. And in general, that the more we buy our medical cannabis here in Utah, the lower the prices go. But that's a really long-winded way, 5 or 6 years it would take for the economics to kind of show that. We did not have any negative patient responses to anybody that knew they were actually directly affected, although that was around the time that I had about 8 to 10 patients leave their card because of various reactions that they felt were directly related to the cannabis. So, 8 to 12 out of 2,500 certifications since 3 years ago, I feel like is an acceptable rate of failure, and it's far superior than any pharmaceutical. But whenever someone says, I don't want my card anymore, we have a standard set of questions that we ask, because we really do want to understand why it has failed. And that's sometimes where we go back to our original notes about what was the original qualifying condition. We ask permission to pull their past laboratory works. We ask the hard questions. Did you get mono in high school? Did you get COVID? Are you sure that all the information we have is accurate? So we do a little bit of due diligence. But I do believe we had a few patients that were negatively affected by that, some of which decided to leave medical cannabis, many of which decided to stay with their cards.
Okay, that's good to know. I have had some responses too. I've had a few doctors, QMPs, who have reached out and said Hey, thanks for giving me the heads up. I actually, in fact, did have patients come in who were concerned and some that did have complaints with side effects. And that's the thing that we have to be careful about is there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know what would happen with the continued use of these byproducts. We just don't have the data to share. And so I still think it's wise for us to act cautiously and be on top of those extraction processes and continue to report to your QMPs if you have any kind of adverse effects, because I think it would be important for the QMPs to document that as well. You know, patients deciding to leave because of product quality concerns.
So we do. So when a patient decides they'll leave their card, I always put a note in their EVS that says they always can reapply and what is the nature and reason. There's a generic note section. Now, I don't know how other QMPs do it, but they may just let the card actually expire. So there was a question, what is the biggest reason that a patient does not want their card anymore? The cost.
Yeah, it really is.
Meaning they may live so close to a border state, and we have many border states that are cannabis friendly, or that the office fee is so extraordinary that there's not the cost benefit ratio. And then one of the things that I love about our EVS is about every 6 or 7 weeks, I run a purchased products report, and I label that care plan, and I save that to a patient file. Whenever someone leaves their card or decides to let their card expire, I go back and look exactly what they purchased. I have to assume that is a majority of what they're using, but we try and look at, okay, was there anything that we missed? For example, people do want access to the medical cannabis, but they don't actually realize they may have a qualifying condition. And so we look back at those original notes. For example, would the state of Utah approve a CUB request for poor appetite for an adult patient who is 21 years or older? Yes, if you document it in the correct way. What is the nature of the poor appetite? I was born premature. I had a gunshot wound to my abdomen when I was a kid. It all has to do with how the provider presents the history of the condition and what it actually means. If someone has undiagnosed Crohn's or ulcerative colitis and their appetite is poor, or they have nausea, but they don't meet the criteria of the diagnosis cachexia, they should apply in terms of a card, meaning that they have a very good chance of actually having that certification reviewed earnestly and getting approved.
Alicia, did you have a question or a comment?
So for me, I have quite a few qualifying conditions for my card, but the main one that I focused on just in the advocacy for TRUCE, for me personally and for others that I know, was thyroid issues. And I'm curious, is that something that's been added to the qualifying list?
No. However, let's say you withheld all information from the provider and you went in and you say, I have a thyroid situation. The first question that a reasonable provider would ask would say, what kind of labs have been done? We could pull labs from a central database. We could see that the thyroid is either high or low, but high or low thyroid is only one dimension. We also have Graves and Hashimoto's. The fundamental definition of a qualifying medical condition is that it is disabling or debilitating, not necessarily severe. This is where patients get very confused about the qualifying conditions because they hear the word chronic and they think severity. Chronic has nothing to do with severity, it has to do with timing.
Persistence.
Persistence. Right? Persistence and frequency and timing. And these things sound like minutia, but in medical school, they're actually quite different. So if someone has slight yet chronic pain anywhere in their body, and that goes on for more than 6 weeks, it is defined as chronic pain in the state of Utah. Does not have to be severe. The nature of a thyroid condition is complex, and it's probably one of the most difficult things to learn as a medical provider. But at the heart of the issue is that our thyroid is our natural caffeine gland, which turns itself on at 4 a.m. and should naturally help us wake up. Without that, there's several functions in the body that basically are failing. So I won't ask you your individual thyroid condition, but I can promise you that at some point, hopefully, a good provider will offer you testing for Graves', which is more rare, and then testing for Hashimoto's, which is much more common. About 30% of us, literally 30% of us, will get Hashimoto's in our lifetime. And Hashimoto's can actually be related to gut problems, nausea, migraines, and even joint chronic pain, even when the pain is in the joint, but the problem actually is arising in the gland. So it's a very good question.
Yeah.
What if your thyroid is on Central Standard Time, so it wakes you up at 3:30 instead every morning?
Shift workers. You're describing a shift worker. So that's called autonomic brain fry. It's a problem of the autonomic system, and it's actually a big circadian rhythm problem. It's a problem for veterans who are off on weird schedules. It's actually a big problem for healthcare workers that tend to work weird shifts. And the thyroid has to be tested in the morning, in our normal circadian morning between 5 a.m. and 11 a.m. And so one of the things we do as healthcare providers, we first look at the timing of when the sample was taken. But remember, there's only the hormones. Hormones of the thyroid is only one dynamic. First best question of a thyroid, a concern would be, did you get mono in high school? Yes or no? The next question is, what is the profession of your parent? If a parent has served in the military, was an educator, was at all involved in public service, police officer, EMT, or was in healthcare, or worked around those industries, we assume that the patient has Epstein-Barr and has that normal risk for Hashimoto's, even if the labs are normal. So the labs for Hashimoto's are TPO and TGAB. They're very important that we all get those at least once in our lifetime because they're very cheap labs, and they help us understand, does the lower hypothyroid of the thyroid actually represent an autoimmune illness? And those could not be more different. One we treat with cannabis and anti-inflammatories, and the other we treat with artificial or pork thyroid hormone tablets.
Oh my gosh, William, I'm making a note to go see my doc.
TPO and TGAB, they're called thyroid autoantibodies, and they are very common. And essentially, it's one of the most interesting things as a provider to deal with, because we see it sometimes and we know it, but then we have to go back to the note and we say, well, what part of the body is the person actually complaining about?
I see, and this is a bit of why I used to poo-poo on the QMP program until I met with one of our QMPs she runs a clinic and I really adore her. And what she really taught me are patients need this kind of education. And what you're sharing with us today really helps me understand as an advocate that there is that value between the patient and the caregiver, the provider,
Absolutely.
the medical provider. I'm a patient. I wake up in the middle of the night. I wake up like between 3 and 4 every night. And just listening to this small bit, I now just realize, oh my gosh, I've got to go get checked. And so you can't just assume, again, like we've said so many times before, cannabis is not a panacea. And sometimes you can't just smoke things away. You should be working with somebody who can look at the whole body health. There are chemicals, minerals, there's diet, there's hormones, there's so much going on. You cannot just smoke 2 joints and think it's going to be okay.
So I've got 3 more things that are very interesting for Alicia's question. First off, where was she born? If she was born anywhere in the Intermountain West or her parents, we have high amounts of naturally occurring soil radiation. It's normal. On top of that, we have all the atomic testing downwinding as dust in our natural Utah soil. And we have fluoride that has an extremely high amount parts per million in Idaho. So where someone grew up actually does matter in terms of their thyroid. Now, there is nothing wrong with vegetarianism or veganism. However, those two food choices actually have a lot to do.
Drew.
They actually have a lot to do with the low consumption of iodine, which can turn into goiter. Goiter is so easy to deal with, so it's no big deal, but that would be another dynamic. The only other dynamic that we think about is someone's occupation. For example, if a patient comes in and they say, I'm a dental hygienist, I say, how long have you had a thyroid condition? Epoxies that we put on our teeth, chemicals, really? And the fact that even our modern handheld x-ray guns are wonderful. However, there is the brimstone scatter of x-rays that we are all exposed to in terms of dental x-rays. So someone's occupation is actually quite interesting. As a nurse, my first job was giving chemotherapy to kids. That's a chemical exposure that scares me now, but it's part of our history, and we all live in a place where inversion is real. So those are all the things that actually play into how the thyroid hears chemicals. Now, would any of us drink butane as a hobby?
No.
Why not?
Well, that's just gross.
It's gross, right? So harm reduction would say if you're going to combust your cannabis, you do that in the privacy of your own home with a medical cannabis card issued by the state of Utah using hempwick, a candle, or matches. Why would I say that? The estrogenic nature of gas and oil is absorbed by the gut and the thyroid. So when we test a man's blood for bad male estrogen or a girl for naturally occurring estrogens, we try and figure out where those estrogens are coming from so that we can risk analysis that thyroid, because the thyroid is going to be the destination.
Tim, you had a question? Make sure you unmute.
Yeah, just really quick. He was talking about the combustion with the just the combustion with that, but the butane for the thyroid. That's why one of the comments that we made on the post earlier today is that the byproducts of the butane, propane, and the extracts that are made with the concentrate pens that are actually recommended for the majority of patients here in Utah.
Go ahead.
It's a big concern because the pen is also made of hardened resin plastic. Therefore, there's actually gas and oil in the plastic resin itself. We turn the device on, it warms up, it off-gases a little of that polyvinyl chloride as a fumable substance. So it actually is a very, it's something that I issue every patient what's called a glove box letter, which is a set of tips and tricks that we've learned over the years. And part of on that glove box letter is that what you do in the privacy of your own home is just that, but that dry herb vaporization with the actual unprocessed flower is actually slightly cleaner, if you will, than using an electronic cartridge, because the cartridge also is plastic, warms itself up. All plastic is made of gas and oil and dinosaurs. Nothing wrong with that. We all love our plastic dishes. But in a sense, if someone has an estrogenic disease process, polycystic kidney disorder in men, uterine fibroids, polycystic ovary syndrome, or uterine fibroids, endometriosis, or fibrocystic breast syndrome in girls, those are considered estrogenic diseases, or a prostate issue in boys. If they have any of those or concerns of those, then those patients really need to think through, okay, well, where is this gas and oil and fumes coming from? Therefore, we think about dry herb vaporization rather than the combustion with a butane lighter.
All things to be very concerned about and mindful of. And when you think of these synthetic byproducts also being in the mix with the cannabis, it is concerning. And as a patients group, and everybody knows I've been a dry herb vaporizing girl forever and ever and ever. Yes, it's concerning to me that patients aren't getting the best that they could get. Go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, so just as you've been talking, I do what I do over here on my iPad. So I'm usually looking down, Googling what is Hashimoto's disease, and just going down the list, it's like I'm thinking, oh, fetch, and I think it's most people don't know. So William, if I had to Google, can you just give us a 45-second WebMD rundown? What is Hashimoto's disease? What should people be looking for?
So Dr. Hashimoto's was the Japanese scientist that discovered that an intrinsic autoimmune inflammation of the thyroid is the second most common autoimmune illness. Patients need to hear that when we say the term autoimmune, we are not referring to cancer. It's very important they understand that. Autoimmune means that excessive or unwanted inflammation has arisen in the thyroid, but then they touch their thyroid and they say, well, my thyroid feels fine. And I say, it arises in the thyroid. Those particles of excessive inflammation get dumped into the blood, traveling throughout the body. Therefore, chronic pain has to be assumed that it's not musculoskeletal until we prove that there's been an injury. Meaning that in adult medicine, especially because of COVID, we have to assume that in a Mormon LDS Swedish stock state with lots of Sorensens and Hansens and lots of Swedish names, that the autoimmune nature of someone's body is present, is assumed until it is ruled out. Essentially, tissues, there are 4 fundamental tissues of the body. Epithelial, which includes your glandular, muscles, we talked earlier about 3 different types. Connective, pretty complex, includes the blood, and nervous. Autoimmune inflammation typically inflames 1 or more of those 4 fundamental tissues. So the entire body is made up of 4 tissue types, which is pretty incredible. MS is a type of an intrinsic autoimmune inflammation of neurological tissue. It's actually quite rare. Over here on the epithelial, which includes glandular tissue, that's where a majority of autoimmune illnesses center. Now, there's a lining of skin all over the inside and outside of our body, including the linings of our lungs and the linings of our gut and the linings of glandular tissue. So an organ begins to fail because excessive unwanted inflammation invades that tissue and begins to kind of curdle that tissue, causing it to dry up or to get larger. So any organ in the body can have an autoimmune reaction. And this is part of what we've learned during COVID. And in fact, viruses like COVID or Epstein-Barr can turn on the body's ability to attack itself.
Oh, wow. Wow, this has been so fascinating. You're muted, Alicia.
Sorry, I didn't want to talk over anybody. I myself have Hashimoto's, and I have really struggled to get back onto my feet and function daily. Cannabis has helped me so much. It has been a lifesaver. But I'm not going to get into my whole personal story. I just thought that I would say everything you're talking about is exactly correct. I have 3 of those issues: the nervous, the muscle, and the skeletal. I have all kinds of, like, they come and go. It's like intermittent is what I call it. It's like my little joke about have this intermittent issue, but and I'm consistently having to medicate when I'm feeling that way. And that's literally how I function. And that's another reason why I'm always like, hey, Christine, we got to get this on. How do I do this? We've got to get Hashimoto's on this list, because I mean, and mine wasn't inherited. I was overdosed by a doctor.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Who misdiagnosed me. And I had all kinds of other health problems, I've had strokes and seizures and whatnot. And I've had to overcome all that. And I finally found out what was wrong with me after everything. But I think it's important. It should be on the list, especially if it's, what did you say, class 2 or something? You said something, it's like one of the number 2.
The second most common autoimmune illnesses, right behind lupus, right behind mixed connective tissue disorder.
We had autoimmune in our conditions list. So I don't know, if it's something we need to advocate for, William. We might have you come and maybe we'll just send this Zoom over to somebody. We'll send it all to all the legislators, because if they watch this, they're going to learn a lot. This was an amazing show, amazing hour.
About a year ago, I started bugging the ear of one of the lawyers who is very quietly a cannabis advocate on the Hill. And he actually mentioned that the legislatures are open to adding illnesses. And really, instead of adding Hashimoto's, what we would say is an autoimmune condition, because then that would cover all autoimmune conditions, including Hashimoto's and Graves'.
And I have been working with some people, and we would like to do away with the conditions list. We would like to see that go. We would like to put the authority of that back to the patient and the physician or the medical practitioner, because that's really where it needs to be. The legislators don't know. They just don't know. We've seen legislation in other states. I wrote that into the Wyoming ballot initiative. The medical authority up there was really warm to that. So it's something we should do. We should really think about that. So I don't know. Are we coming up on the hour there, Drew?
Oh, we've blown past it, hour plus 10.
Oh, awesome. William,
Thank
how
you
can
so
people
much.
find you? Can you give us your handles real quick before we sign off this evening?
Feel free to email me directly. I'd rather just be emailed directly, because then I could have a private conversation with anybody.
Wonderful. Again, we'll make sure we grab your email address and we'll provide it for our patient population that follows us in our little community. Thank you for everybody that joined. This was just an amazing hour. If you know us and you love us, donate to us. Go to our website, truceutah.org. We want to keep bringing these community leaders, these people who are helping us get healthy and well to you. And we want to get out there and see more of you. So please join us again next week. We'll have another amazing topic. Thank you, William. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you for being with us, William.
Yeah.
Thank you all
Everybody.
so very much. This was an amazing hour. You guys have a wonderful weekend. We'll chat you soon.
Bye-bye.